Hello, story lovers, and if you're watching video lovers as well, this is Laurel McHargue, and you're listening to and watching Alligator Preserves. I have a really special guest today, and we're going to talk about Paul Thaler and his amazing book. And I just have to show this right away. I'm going to show this a couple times during our visit, Paul, Bronxland. So, Paul, let's just get right to who you are. Who is Paul Thaler?
Who is Paul Thaler? That question. Well, I am a longtime writer. Bronxland actually is my first novel, and a labor of love, which I'll talk more about a little later in our interview. But I've also authored two nonfiction works, one called The Watchful Eye, the other called The Spectacle. And I'm a former journalist, magazine editor. I've been a media commentator for a number of national programs like CNN and HBO documentaries and the like. And I'm a professor of communications and journalism at Adelphi University here in New York, as well as New York University. So that's the short resume. And just great being with you here, Laurel.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for taking time with me. So you have done things, been places, and you have stories to tell. How did the idea of Bronxland evolve?
Well, interestingly enough, about 6 years ago, I had the audacity to think that I could write a memoir about my life story. And I did so. I spent the next 2 to 3 years, in fact, writing what I thought was the great memoir, and made, I wouldn't say the mistake, but I did hand over this manuscript to a good friend of mine who's a writer, and he made the comment that perhaps, but just perhaps, my family will be interested in reading this memoir. And given the fact that I was going for a larger audience than 3 or 4 or 5 people that may look at this manuscript, I turned it into a novel. I turned it into a semi-autobiographical novel over the next 2 years, frankly. So the book itself was about 5 years in the making. And I have to say, the audience has grown to more than those few. And it really was a labor of love, this book, because it allowed me to go back to the old neighborhood and just reimagine those days. And the response actually has been quite interesting, frankly. So we could talk more about that. But that is kind of the journey of that book. And here it is.
So you say the response has been interesting. And I have to tell you, I didn't grow up in the Bronx. I grew up in the South Shore of Boston. But you took me back to my middle school years in a big way. And I don't know how you did it. How did you do it? And how many people have thanked you for taking them back to their middle school years?
Well, we all share that commonality, that coming of age story, the time of adolescence. And if the book resonates, it resonates on that level. The fact that it touches that part of our human existence, that journey that we take, and all the highs and the lows, and just sorting it out. And I hope I was able to capture that in the book. And if I might say so, the reaction has been very, very, very positive. And many folks kind of speaking about the book in the same terms you just mentioned, the idea that I could identify with my Paul Wolfenthal character. Not to mention folks from the old neighborhood, from the old Bronx, getting him back in touch. If I could say, I actually got emails from my old paper boy, who I didn't really know back in the early 1960s.
But he knew you. He remembered you.
He remembered my apartment. He remembered delivering the paper. Several people from back then got in touch. People, frankly, I didn't remember, but they remembered me through the story. Say, Paul, I read the book and thank you for taking me back. And there was that feeling of reunion. that was part of this experience. It truly has been amazing, just connecting in all sorts of ways with people I knew and people I didn't know, people who said, hey, thanks for coming back to the old neighborhood. Yeah, so it's been that.
I think you did something magical. You really did. As a seventh grade English teacher, your scene about the insanity of that choosing your seat day. You had me at the edge of my seat because I was so nervous for. I was gonna say you, but I was nervous for your character, Paul, and it was hilarious and accurate. And I remembered my first day, my plan was to put up a seating chart on the front board and have everyone find their names and then find their seats. And that was far too much. I ended up saying, kind of like your teacher did, stop, slow down, hang on. How about stand against the side of the wall and I'll tell you where to sit. But so I actually had a little control over that. But your situation there with losing that prime seat, oh my gosh, I was just horrified for you.
Well, yes, I lost the chance to be with my would-be girlfriend back in seventh grade. I was beaten out to that seat, and
by the bad boy in the class.
There was always that bad boy, and Tommy Brannigan hopefully is a memorable character in that book as well. But I have to say that a number of those incidents really were based on actual real life situations. That bad boy you're mentioning was actually a bully that was very, very real. And the confrontation with the bully in that particular book was also quite real. So I had the luxury, if that's the word, of reliving that past and putting it into story form. And of course, I've taken liberties throughout the book. It is a novel. But at the heart of the book, there's a lot of truth to it.
I did the same thing with my first novel, Miss, which was based on that first year of teaching seventh grade English. And I journaled that whole first year because I couldn't believe what I was experiencing in the classroom each day. And so I had a year's worth of journal entries that 7 years later I ended up loosely fictionalizing, as I believe you did here too. So that fight with Tommy that you had, you say that actually happened.
Yeah.
And talk to me about the idea of respect and in the animal world, because that's kind of an animal world thing, isn't it?
Yeah, again, the school is an interesting environment, right? There's the schoolyard where kids meet, and that's one environment. Then there's the classroom, another environment. Then there's your relationship with teachers, and in the book, I have several relationships with teachers, including my beloved Miss Krause in the book, who existed actually, not quite in the form that you see it in the book, but someone who stays with me. Here I am a half century later, and there she is in my mind's eye. And then there's Mr. Pagliaro. That actually is his real name, and I mentioned in the acknowledgments and notes at the end of that book some of the parts that were real. And Mr. Pagliaro, who was my music teacher, was very real. And if you don't mind me getting off on the anecdote.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, that situation where I was the lead clarinetist in the school orchestra, and at the end of the year, there is this little tiny bronze medal that's handed out to the leaders of the different sections of the orchestra. And I was well deserving, if I might say, of that bronze medal for the woodwind section. And Mr. Pagliaro, gave that medal to a second level clarinet player. And I was devastated. Devastated, not for the medal, really. When I look back on it, it was Mr. Pagliaro, his acceptance.
Oh, we just froze a little bit.
Acknowledgement. And so when he gave the medal to someone else, I was actually emotional as a result. And in fact, he did call me into the office. It plays out just as it does in the book, frankly. And he gives me this incredible medal he received from his days in the Army, as I describe in the book. And to this day, I remember that small scene in one's life, and I try to capture it in that chapter. Even thinking about it just brings back an emotional feeling about Mr. Pagliaro, who I acknowledge by name and by story. So we, if we're lucky, we have those people in our lives.
Yes, and that scene was so powerful because it was poignant, and it was, I could feel the character's angst, and the you did deserve it, he did deserve it, and yet the lesson that Mr. Pagliaro taught you was so valuable.
No question. And his reasoning, actually, for giving out the medal to the first player was his kind heart. You know, he really wanted to help that student, and I recognized that later. So you just give him a boost. Everyone understood the dynamics of that orchestra room, but here was a kid he wanted to help. And that only made the scene more poignant for me, because it wasn't as if he was now trying to help make me feel better. It was the fact that he was reaching out to another student with his good heart, realizing that it had affected me, and then doing something about it. So, you know, that's just one small incident in a much larger story, of course, but it certainly was part of my story.
You have so many incidents in this story. I want to talk about them all, and I know we don't have time to talk about them all, but the idea of being in lust with your teacher, Miss Bonnet, in that art project. But talk about that art project.
True. Honest to goodness. So I do not use the real name of my former 7th grade math teacher, but Miss Bonnet, the fictional character, is quite real. And she was this beautiful, incredibly dynamic teacher who taught a subject I had no interest in, called mathematics. And if I could say, I just fell in love with her for all the wrong reasons, I suppose.
No, all the right reasons for a boy that age,
yes.
Right? I mean, that's when, talk about hormones raging, right? And
well, it was all that. And in fact, in my art class, I couldn't have made that story up. I couldn't have made, my mind couldn't have gone to that place in a fictional way. And in fact, I had to sit down with Miss Bonnet and explain why I had, in fact, composed this naked art drawing of Miss Bonnet, signing her name to it. And here I am sitting in a room with her. She's holding up this picture. I had composed this art through all sorts of colored paper, glossy paper that I had put together as I described in the story. And absolutely true, mortified, and needless to say, probably traumatized. So I had a way of revisiting that place in Bronxland. And I have to say that Miss Bonnet was very, very kind, although my art teacher was not. And it was, I'm sure, the talk of Junior High School 82, which, interestingly enough, I've been in contact through Facebook through Junior High School 82 alumni. And now they're all kind of coming back to me and saying, and we're kind of revisiting those days online, frankly.
Oh my gosh.
So that's another anecdote from the book,
yeah. Yes, for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Paul Thaler, the author of Bronxland, a book that will take you back to your middle school years, regardless, I think, of where you grew up. It's amazing. You have it all in this book. You've got sex in the laundry room and the creepy bald guy in the theater. Oh my gosh. Which one do you want to talk about?
Oh my gosh, I don't know where to start. Yeah, well, on one level, it really was a time of innocent love, and my Dee O'Hara was really a composite of I guess a few girls during a period of a few years that I got to know, and one girl in particular. and one girl who broke my heart, as hearts are meant to be broken, and during that time, and there was a character, I can't say it was totally accurate, the depiction of a scene where I come upon this teenage couple having sex.